Hi, my name is Keith Foles, and I'm going to talk today about my latest book with the University of Michigan Press, which is Clear Grammar, Volume 1. This is the second edition of a 4-volume series. Clear Grammar originally came out, I think, 1997, the first edition of Book 1, and this is a completely new edition. It's a completely new book even, I mean to say. In fact, we even discussed the possibility of renaming the book. It's that different. Clear Grammar 1 has 6 new things I'm going to talk about in this particular edition. The first thing is most books have a deductive approach to teaching grammar, which is not a bad thing. Deductive approach is simply when the grammar is presented very clearly, directly to the student. It could be you at the blackboard or the whiteboard actually presenting your grammar, writing the grammar boxes and rules on the board. That's a deductive approach to doing this. Sort of the opposite way of doing this is an inductive approach. An inductive approach for some learners is better because you require the learners to try to figure out the rules on their own. Now, this is actually a little bit more difficult for most teachers to do, especially novice teachers who hardly know the rule very well and who also might feel uncomfortable or nervous teaching grammar in the first place. In this book, in every single chapter, there is a deductive presentation of the grammar and an inductive presentation of the grammar. Now, personally, I wouldn't use both of them. I would use one of them depending on the chapter that I'm teaching, but this is a personal choice. However, I have not seen any books that have an inductive and deductive way of presenting grammar, both ways, I should say, in each chapter. And a real plus of this is that if you have students who, for example, don't understand present progressive or present perfect, rather than using the exact same explanation yet again, why not present the grammar in a different way? So again, we have an inductive approach in the very beginning, which leads the students and the teacher through the grammar, followed by a deductive approach, which has a table and charts and rules all right there for the students. What this book also has is tons and tons, umpteen practice activities in each of the chapters. This is really not so different than most books, but I would add that in addition to the traditional fill in the blank, multiple choice, gap filling, find the error kinds of activities, we also have fun, meaningful speaking activities in the book. For example, in the present progressive chapter, you might find a simple yes-no game, which is similar to the childhood game of Battleship that we all know. In the chapter on adjectives, for example, you will find a game that's very similar to Guess Who, where you have a grid of 24 different women, and you have to guess which one is your partner's, the person that your partner has chosen based on descriptive adjectives of the person in that picture. A third thing that really separates this whole series from any other grammar book grammar series that I've seen is vocabulary. Many of you know that that is my main research interest, second language vocabulary. And corpus linguistics now is a really strong part, I'm happy to say, in our field. And more textbooks finally are paying attention to this. In this grammar series, of course, I presented the grammar point deductively and inductively. You've got tons of exercises. And up to that point, I would say that this book is pretty similar, or sort of similar, to many other books in the field. But I've gone one step further for every grammar point. There is a corpus-informed list of key vocabulary. So, for example, when you learn present progressive, what's the form look like? Be, verb, ing. And then what's the function? To talk about something happening right now. When do you use it? With right now, now, today, this week, etc. But we also go on to tell students you can't use present progressive with a handful of verbs. We don't say I am owning, you don't say I'm having a book, you don't say I'm possessing a pencil. And that's where most books stop. But what I've done is I've actually gone to consult different corpus samples to figure out what are the 10 or 12 most commonly used verbs with present progressive. So for example, even though you could say I am discovering, and you could say she is climbing a mountain, we don't use those verbs. So if you're curious as to what the top 10 or 12 verbs are in the present progressive, then you get a copy of Clear Grammar 1. I believe that's in chapter 8. All right, our fourth thing is the use of online activities. Again, lots of books have online activities, or they have activities on a CD, but when I'm teaching a class, it's confusing to me as to when I'm supposed to actually do the online activity. So do I wait until I'm halfway through the activity, the chapter, before I do 1.7? Or is there a certain page that I'm supposed to finish first? Is there a chart that tells me this information? If you're teaching several classes a day, and some people are teaching classes in several different schools, it's hard enough already just to get to class and be organized and be prepared for all the grammar questions that are about to come at you from your students. So in order to make this easier, what I've done is I actually have the information about the online activities in the textbook, in the student textbook. So for example, when you finish presenting the present progressive, there might be a small notation there. It'll say, now do online activity 3.7, which tells you to go to activity 3.7 at the University of Michigan Press website. And information is there with the book. And the students can complete these activities on their own. Each activity has about 10 items in it. 10's, I think, are a reasonable number to know whether you know what you're doing or not. And you can also print this sheet out with the results and bring this into class if you have a question that you want to ask your teacher. A key point in teaching any grammar in an ESL or an EFL situation is you have to know what errors are most likely made by your particular learners. I get asked this all the time, how do I know which grammar to teach? Well, I'm in no position to tell you that. In fact, you as a teacher of that group of students are the best person to know what your students need or don't need. It all goes back to learner needs. If you're teaching Spanish speakers, for example, you know, for example, that when you're teaching the verb to be, am, is, are, in lesson 1, you know your students are going to say things like, I have hungry, and I have thirsty, and I have 17 years, or I have 17 years old, because Romance languages, Spanish, French, for example, tend to use have instead of be with those expressions. Or an Arabic speaker, in simple present tense, they will leave the verb to be completely out. So what you get is I teacher, I hungry, I 17 years old. So it's impossible for you to know all of those mistakes. You really will only learn those mistakes in one of two ways. One is that you actually can speak those different languages. And most ESL, EFL teachers I know one, maybe two different foreign languages. But the other way to do this is, after years of experience, you will actually know what kind of mistakes are made by Spanish speakers, Japanese speakers, Arabic speakers, etc. In the meantime, what do? Because you don't have time to go out and learn a new language, and you don't have time to get 17 years worth of experience overnight. In the book, what I've done is actually made reference to not all, but to the main, most common mistakes that are made by learners of English at that level. Another book that I have with University of Michigan Press is The Keys to Teaching Grammar. In Keys, you will find notes to explain the grammar that's presented in this book, and even if you don't use Clear Grammar, because it's the basic grammar points, those points will be covered in the grammar series that you're using. So you refer to Keys. Keys will also tell you, for example, if you look up present progressive, it'll tell you the same thing, the form, the function, key issues, problems that learners of Arabic, Japanese, Spanish, etc. will have with that particular grammar point. So I often get asked, do you translate for your students? I don't translate, but here's how I use translation. I have a really good idea of what kind of mistakes my students are going to make, because I know that they're probably saying in Spanish, I have hungry, which is going to come out as I have hungry instead of I am hungry. I can't overemphasize how important knowing the errors is. And I hope that you'll take a look at the chart in each of the lessons in the Clear Grammar series. The last thing I want to talk about is editing and writing. I hear all the time from teachers that they really want their students to have better writing, and they're very concerned about hearing their students when they produce sentences that have mistakes in their conversation, or when they're seeing it on paper. Well, I think what I hear from teachers all the time is, I'm really disturbed, or I'm confused, or I'm perplexed as to why we've covered all this grammar, yet when I ask them to write some simple sentences of things we've just covered, those mistakes actually pop up right there. The problem comes because you've taught the grammar, and we know that teaching doesn't always equal learning, and in the second language acquisition process, it's not a 30-second operation. It's not a quick band-aid. Well, I've taught present perfect, therefore now they can form present perfect. And even if they can form it, can they actually use it? Do they know the functions of this? And even if they do know the functions, can they actually use it in the way that we want them to? For example, in a paragraph. So if you're only having your students do fill-in-the-blank activities, it is illogical to expect them to suddenly be able to produce this in free writing or in free conversation. So I was talking about this in terms of writing. I have a paragraph or a set of simple sentences numbered from 1 to 8, for example, and each of those sentences could have certain kinds of mistakes. What I never do is turn adult learners loose and say, find the mistakes. And I don't just say, find the 7 mistakes. I want them to look for certain key mistakes. For example, if we're doing present progressive, I know they're going to say, I am, live in Orlando. If we're doing the adjectives, they're going to say, I have a book blue. So those are the specific errors that are mentioned in the activity. It will tell you you need to find 3 errors where the adjective is in the wrong position with the noun. And then you go through the 8 sentences and find those. Again, if you want your students to have better writing at a paragraph level, you can't depend on just these simple fill-in-the-blank activities. Which also reminds me, I should have added, that when you look at the practice activities in this book, in the previous edition, you would have found 20 sentences which were unrelated, which is pretty traditional in a lot of books, I think. And I don't think necessarily that it's a bad thing, but in order to help students develop their vocabulary, i.e. have better English overall, what I've tried to do in the series is have 20 sentences or have 10 sentences and they're all related to one topic. So what you have is sort of some extended discourse even for students at the level 1 level here. Again, this series has 4 books, and what I've just spoken about is book 1 of Clear Grammar.